Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you my March reading wrap up. So March was a pretty epic reading month. We've got a lot of non-fiction coming up as well as a few big beefy things off of my to be read list. And the first book that I finished in the month of March was War and Peace. So I've been reading this since January and I did manage to get it finished in the first couple of days of March. I'm so pleased that I did manage to get this done. I listened to this on audiobook. I have a full review that I will link down below and in the cards, but basically if you are unaware of what War and Peace is about, it is a fairly infamous Russian classic which follows a couple of families through the Napoleonic War, spanning about 15 years, maybe a fraction longer. It is a massive book. This thing clocks in at 1200 pages and it is an absolute beast, but I genuinely really loved it. I thought that the characters and character arcs that we went on were fascinating. I loved the bits about war. Tolstoy also goes on sort of conversations about philosophy of war and what it means to be like a great general and sort of the impact of the individual man compared to sort of armies and units and sort of the men on the ground compared to the people in the war rooms. And yeah, just fantastic and fascinating all around. A really enjoyable read, and I was genuinely sad when it was over, which seems a bit insane to say about a 1200 page book, but I could have happily gone for another 300-400 pages. It is insane how big it is, but if you just kind of mentally think of it as like two of those big beefy fantasy books out there combined into one, like George R.R. Martin's entire Game of Thrones trilogy, it's way more than that, like book series combined together is tons more pages than this, and I think that this is more compelling and more interesting and has better story arcs, so definitely worth the read, but I will link my full review of it down below. Then we move on to my Women in History readathon reading. I did really well for that particular readathon, and I think I managed to read 6 of the 9 prompts that I was going to. The first one I finished is Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur was a fairly prolific member of the Black Panthers, and was the story it's non-fiction, it's her autobiography or memoir. It opens with her in hospital having been shot by police. They have killed her friend and are accusing her of attacking a policeman. They like pulled her over on the side of the road, and then it said that she attempted to kill one of them. She's very badly injured and she's essentially being tortured and abused by them to try and get her to give up stuff and basically say that she did do this. The book then alternates between her experiences both in hospital, prison, and also her like fight with the courts with this particular case and thing that she's been accused of, and then cuts with her life going all the way back to her childhood through to the modern day moment of this court. I really enjoyed this as a reading experience. I know very little about the Black Panthers, so this was fascinating to see sort of her experiences and sort of her thought process about sort of rights and sort of activism in general, and kind of when she did agree with the Black Panther movement and when she didn't agree with them, and also the way that the US government and police were very much cracking down on her and accusing her of a lot of different things, and the way that that then would be dealt with in court, and the various injustices that she had to deal with and atrocities, like for example them beating the crap out of her when she'd been shot. So yeah, really interesting. And I'm not normally a massive memoir fan because I find people's childhoods incredibly boring, so I never like it when we do like the sweeping look at someone's life, but the intercutting between the modern day, current day, what's happening in the courts, with then chapters from her childhood and going forward like that, helped to keep it fresh and didn't mean that I felt like we were bogged down in like origin story for too long, which is always my least favourite part of a memoir. So really interesting. I also listened to it on audiobook and it just had like a lovely rhythm to it, so yeah, greatly appreciated that. The next book I finished is ETA Lemon, The Woman Who Saved the Birds by Tessa Boase. This was sort of a bit of a hit and miss kind of read for me. It was a slightly strange book. Etta Lemon was a big advocate and sort of one of the original founding members of the RSPB, and this book actually, whilst it is focused on her and her sort of work within birds' rights as such, it also follows the suffragette movement and looks at I nearly said Harriet Tubman because my brain is in different mode. Amelia Pankhurst. God, that, yeah, don't get those two confused. They are doing different things. There we go, I'm back in focus. So, yeah, I feel like this book almost needs a rebranding because it was actually really interesting, more so than the cover would suggest, because it is about a 50-50 split between the RSPB and the suffragette movement and the suffragist movement and the distinctions between the two. I liked the conversations that were happening. Basically, the reason why the RSPB was founded was because at the time women were wearing feathers and dead birds in their hats in millinery, and it was absolutely decimating bird populations all across the world. And so the big sort of rallying war cry of the RSPB was to try and stop the use of these feathers, and the suffragettes actually used the fact that they were very feminine. They always wore these big hats with lots and lots of feathers and sort of the archetypal quintessential femininity look of the time, whilst they were doing their various unladylike things like protesting and sort of the vandalism that they did, to kind of juxtapose the sort of view of them as traditionally feminine but not feminine, and what does that even mean. So in doing so, they accidentally became two sides of the same, like they became sort of warring factions, and Etta Lemon was not particularly pro the women's rights movement and the movement for women to vote, which is very interesting. It's sort of a fun look at her and a kind of look at the time. So it was genuinely a very good book, but it felt a little bit bitty in places. We did too much of a close zoom in on a few sort of secondary and tertiary characters that I didn't really care that much about. We definitely had a lot of tangents, and I think that the book would actually do better if it was rebranded to discuss the fact that it actually is a sweeping look at the suffragettes. And I feel like I learned more about the suffragettes than I almost did about the RSPB, which is a really sort of interesting take on a book that is literally called Etta Lemon, because I think Etta Lemon only features in about 50% of it. But I would recommend this if you are a fan of nature writing or history, because it is really cool as like a social history look, and sort of a look at women's places in the world. And Tessa Boase has like some really interesting conversations there, so I think it is better than the title would suggest, which is crazy. It's now got really sunny and I'm like hella washed out. Look at that, I'm glowing. The angels have opened. They apparently appreciate the birds as well. Okay, the next book I finished is In Black and White by Alexandra Wilson. This is the memoir of a woman who is a defence attorney and a judge, and she is also black, and it is her conversation about her experiences being in a minority within the justice system, and sort of, you know, how she frequently would get mistaken for being one of the defendants, and sort of the very casual racism that she suffered. It was an interesting look at how the British justice system worked, and I definitely learned a lot about sort of behind the scenes things and like how people get assigned to cases and what it's like to be a defence attorney. In terms of actually as a conversation of racism, it felt a little bit of kind of social justice 101. Like the opening thing is basically representation matters, and it's like, well, yes, representation does matter, I completely agree with you, but you're trying very hard to convince me of this fact, and like I'm kind of already on board with you here. And I didn't feel like there was quite as much of a conversation, the macro look at sort of yeah, like race and the justice system as a whole. But it was a really interesting look at Alexandra's life, and her reason for going into the justice system is because I think it was her cousin was killed when she was younger, basically because of sort of a police brutality kind of thing. So it was really interesting. It was like a gang thing, and then the police didn't look into it or something like that. So it was interesting seeing her motivations and reasoning for wanting to go into law, and then also the fact that her cousin's case gets used at times later when she's studying, and sort of the weird emotions that causes when you're kind of forced to confront that level of violence again. So it was an interesting read, but I kind of wished it had gone into a bit more detail, and it did feel a little bit sort of, you know, racism 101, oh it sucks, nobody else looks like me, which I completely agree with, but also was a bit like basic, if that makes sense. The next book I read is The War Queens, Extraordinary Women Who Ruled the Battlefield by Jonathon W. Jordan. This was cool, but again, a bit bitty and a bit weird. Everything is sort of like a really good read, but if that makes sense this month. Everything's sort of hovering in the 4-star region. This is a look at a bunch of different women, military leaders, queens, people who were very prolific militarily, but were women throughout history who have quite often been ignored. You definitely get some sort of big name people in there, and then some of the lesser known ones have much shorter bits about them, which makes sense because we have a lot less information about them. What I really liked about this book was, as it went through to like through time, it took it all the way up to modern day, and it included a couple of political figures that you wouldn't expect to necessarily see because they're not strictly speaking queens. Like it talked about Margaret Thatcher, which was really interesting and kind of cool, and I know some people in the reviews didn't appreciate that fact, but I think that like that is now definitely reaching a time period where it's classed as history. Like, you know, time marches on. We are 24 years into the 21st century, so I do think it's interesting looking at 20th century history and sort of seeing what was happening there. And it's definitely a big gap in my history knowledge because I tend to go back further. So I really enjoyed that fact, but I know some people didn't like it in the reviews and stuff. So yeah, really interesting. There is a varying amount of detail, and so if you're looking for really obscure people, I think that you're going to be a little bit frustrated by this book, because the particularly obscure ones are very, very short, and it doesn't really talk about sources and things like that. But if you're someone who hasn't read a crazy amount in history, or just wants a bit more information, or like a starting point to kind of span a bunch of different time periods, this one's definitely really interesting. It does mention people like Cleopatra as well, and it did a really good job of like bouncing all across the world, so I did appreciate that fact. So yeah, really good read, but a little bit bitty, a little bit awkward, and it took a while to kind of sink into it. Then I read Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and the daughter who changed history. And this one was really interesting to read alongside the War Queens, because Elizabeth I did feature in War Queens and had her own separate section. So it was quite fun learning about her early life and then getting to see this snapshot of her. And I think it was her specifically against Spain, and conversations that were happening around then. But I could be wrong, because that's the problem when you read a bunch of military history in a row, is you kind of forget who's fighting who, which again, possibly another criticism of War Queens was like, it all got a bit samey and a bit hard to follow at certain points. But anyway, we're now talking about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. This is by Tracy Borman. I listened to this on audiobook, and is a look at Anne Boleyn and her relationship with Henry VIII, and then what caused her beheading, and then the sort of knock-on ramifications it had in Elizabeth I's life. It was really interesting, but you definitely need to know a decent amount about the Tudors going into this book. This is not a beginner book for Tudor history. So you need to have done more than just watch the Six to be able to kind of follow what's going on. But I did really enjoy it as a conversation, and Anne Boleyn is definitely a very controversial figure throughout history. She has been demonized, but also sort of evangelicized, I guess, throughout history as both being sort of the martyr but also the witch. And so it's interesting seeing this book trying to take a little bit more of a impartial stance on her and looking at her from both sides of that coin. It was also really interesting because I didn't really know much about Anne Boleyn specifically, beyond that she got beheaded and that it was marrying her that caused the big rift between Protestantism and Catholicism, and sort of the break from the Catholic Church. And this book was really interesting because it talked about the things that were happening behind the scenes sort of socially that caused that point, because obviously it wasn't just that Henry thought that she was fit and then decided to completely fracture religion and Christianity within his country. There was a lot going on, and Anne Boleyn was very prolific within the Protestant movement, and really sort of encouraging this idea of religion being given back to the people, and sort of the chokehold that the Catholic Church had on it. So that was definitely really interesting, because that's something that I didn't know a crazy amount about. And then when we go on to Elizabeth I's life, sort of the look at the ramifications of sort of how much did Anne Boleyn actually feature in her life, because she died or was killed when she was quite young. And like psychologically, what does it do to a person to know that your father had your mother beheaded, being one of the first queens to have actually been executed in years, decades, centuries, and the sort of way that can hang a sort of Damocles kind of over your head as the way that you rule, and sort of how that impacts your decisions, and the very long arduous road to actually her coming on the throne, and the various points where her life was in jeopardy. You know, she was imprisoned and things like that. So it was definitely really, really interesting, but I do warn you, you do need to know a bit about Tudors before going in. It's not a beginner level one, if that makes sense. Then by this point I was kind of burnt out on history, not going to lie, and I just wanted a little bit of a breather, and so I went for a couple of fun romance books. The first one I read was Siren Search by Jen Lynning. This is sort of a historical fantasy romance. It is a Regency era parallel universe equivalent where there are sirens and succubuses and incubuses and a bunch of other sort of mythological creatures, but it is very much in Regency style with the gowns and the balls and the kind of social considerations with that. And it's about a woman who thinks that she has some kind of part succubus to her, but she isn't really too sure, and she's trying to explore this, and then in doing so she gets caught up in a fake dating situation, which then obviously naturally spirals and feelings happen, and it's all really lovely. It was good fun, and I loved the reason why they were fake dating. They were sort of like, he owns a bank and there's fraudulent banknotes, and she's really good at spotting them. So it was sort of a fun like little heist thing going on in the background of like, where is this fraudulent money coming from, who's trying to take them down, how does this kind of work. So I thought it had enough of a plot to hang the fake dating on, that meant that it didn't feel like we were just hanging out with them fake dating for no good reason. Sometimes romance can be a little thin on the plot side, and I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was great fun. I liked the world building. It is book 4 of a series, but I didn't find it difficult to jump in with the world building, and I might actually go back and read the first couple of books because I had a good time and I kind of liked the world and it was very cool. And I do like these sort of Regency but then with a bit of magic thrown in kind of books. So if anybody has any more recommendations for historical fantasy romance books, which I couldn't work out what the hell you call them, because obviously you get romantasy, but historical romantasy is now starting to become such a mouthful. So yeah, entertaining. Then I read a straight just historical romance called Embed with a Blackguard by Cara Maxwell. This one, again, hella fun. This one is actually book 1 in a series. I never end up picking up book 1s in a romance book, so I'm very impressed with myself. And it's about a woman who is actually a spy for the Queen. She's part of her secret service, her lady knights as they are, and she has to get herself in a position where she is kidnapped by a blackguard so that she can find out who his boss is and kind of bring a load of information back to the Queen. As she's kidnapped, she gets dumped on a ship and they go across the high seas, so you've got a kind of like pirate-esque vibe going on, a little bit of swashbuckling in your historical romance if that's your kind of vibe. And it's about them obviously falling in love, the betrayals, he betrays her, she betrays him, miscommunication, etc, etc. And again, generally really, really good fun. I liked both of the characters. I thought the whole like Lady Knight Secret Service thing was a really fun setup. It gave her a lot more agency, which can sometimes be a problem in historical romances, and it was just generally cute and the smart was pretty good. So I would totally recommend checking this book out. We still have more to go. I had such a prolific reading month. This is insane. I'd had like an audiobook on the go in the background. I say I was done with history. I did finish one more actual history book, and that is The Six, The Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts by Loren Grush. This book is fantastic and everyone should freaking read it. It tells the story of the 6 women astronauts, specifically American astronauts, because the Russians did technically beat America to space with women, just saying, the cosmonauts got there first. And it's a look at their careers. So Sally Ryder's the big name one that most people know as the first American woman in space. But it follows the 5 others as well. It's a look at what they were doing before they became astronauts, what their astronaut training was like, and then their first few flights, culminating in the Challenger disaster, which did kill the second American woman in space. I think her name was Julie or Juliet. And then the Challenger inquest and sort of the look into what happened there, of which Sally Ride was a big part of that. She has a wonderful writing style. I think Loren Grush really handles the amount of detail very well. I liked the way that we moved through the timelines. Each woman was given an appropriate amount of time, and it was a really interesting conversation and look at sort of space travel and what was happening in the 70s and 80s with NASA after the space race and landing on the moon was kind of done. What do you do and where do you go next, and sort of the way that space travel was very much being normalized and kind of trivialized, but how ridiculously insane and dangerous it is. And then a look at what NASA is doing now. So really, really good. I loved the audiobook. This would be fine in print form as well. And if you have any kind of interest in like modern history or space travel, definitely check it out. It does not talk much about the science of space travel. It's very focused on the social history side of things, the women, the impact, what it was like for them being the only women within NASA. It talks about other landmarks like the first black man in space, etc, etc. And yeah, really, really interesting. A look at their interactions with the press and sort of how it was handled and the spotlight being on them. It's not talking about how we actually got to space. You need different books for that. But I do have a whole video about space travel which came out recently, and I will link that down below. Then I was kind of bored of my March TBR, and I picked up a few books and kept putting them back down, and I'd just filmed my April TBR and I figured, fuck it, time is an illusion, everything's just a social construct and I don't owe anybody anything. So I started reading the books from my April TBR. The first one that I finished is Herman Koch's Summerhouse with Swimming Pool. This is translated fiction, I believe, Dutch? Yeah, something like that. Herman Koch is fairly notorious for writing awful characters who are incredibly unlikable on purpose, and this book is no different. I gave this book around 4 stars. Sadly, it was not the 5 stars that I had predicted it would be. But basically, it's about a doctor who hates his job, kind of hates his life, definitely hates his patients, and he ends up being, he like is Doctor to the Stars, and he goes on holiday with this movie star stage actor guy who is creepy and kind of horrible. And then the guy ends up dying later, and it's about him being caught in like a medical inquest about medical malpractice and whether he essentially murdered this guy. Or at least that's what the back says it is about. Turns out the medical malpractice stuff is a vanishingly small part of the plot, which did frustrate me a little bit, and is basically the reason why it's only a 4 star. The main focus is actually on the fact that his daughter, spoiler alert, trigger warning, is raped whilst they are on holiday, and him dealing with that and the sort of suspicions he has about the actor and one of the actor's friends who's incredibly creepy and has a very age inappropriate relationship with another woman who is there, who is technically legal but definitely very young, and just sort of a conversation in general around legality of women. So it is a bit creepy and a bit of a weird read. I still gave it 4 stars because I think Herman Koch is a fantastic writer, and it is quite fun hanging out in the heads of these people who are terrible human beings, but it is definitely far more about sexual assault than I was expecting the book to be, and I was a little bit annoyed because the book definitely sells itself as a medical malpractice book, and it's definitely not. So if you don't like unlikable characters, stay the hell away from both this book and this author. But if you kind of want to hang out in the head of someone who, like, basically every bad, awful, intrusive thought that's ever been had was kind of on these pages. And as a reading experience, it is kind of interesting. I don't know what the hell it would be like to try and write it, but it was definitely quite fun in a sort of a voyeuristic way to read, but I don't condone any of the characters at all, and massive trigger warnings for things like sexual assault and just conversations of like minors and things like that. So, you know, go in forewarned. Then on a completely different track, I also finished Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This I loved. I gave 5 stars. I've had a bit of a rocky past with Austen. This is the 4th Austen book I've ever read, and they had been steadily going downhill. The last one I finished was Emma, and I gave it 2 stars and kind of freaking hated it. Whereas this one, so I've been like putting off Austen for a while because I was kind of worried that I'd read the only one of hers I was going to enjoy and everything else was going to be in that kind of ballpark. And Sense and Sensibility has completely knocked that concern out of the water. I absolutely adored it. I listened to it on an audiobook. Rosamund Pike narrated it, and it was wonderful. She's got a whole series of Austen on Audible, so do check that out. And yeah, it was just a really, really fun read. It is about 2 sisters, one who is incredibly sensible and the other one who is silly and frivolous, and is about them being embroiled in 2 different romances which both look like they're not going to go anywhere. They've kind of been misled by the men, and it basically is just Regency Love Island with like everyone having secret relationships with everybody else, promises made behind closed doors that then aren't kept, the rumour mill goes mad, and it's about them trying to deal with being caught in this because they are women with no prospects and, you know, no money, and oh god, how are we going to get a good match? No one wants us, we don't have a dowry kind of energy, and was, yeah, really enjoyable. The secondary and tertiary cast of characters are freaking hilarious in this book. I found myself laughing out loud multiple points, and I really love the journey that the 2 sisters went on. Pacing wise, it is a little bit strange. Everything kind of gets resolved in the final sort of 45 minutes of the audiobook very fast. I was kind of watching the time tick down being like, does this just not have a happily ever after? Since when does an Austen not have a happily ever after? But she does put it out of the bag, but I know some people find the pacing a little irritating for that fact, whereas I was kind of okay with it because it kind of fitted the slightly farcical nature of the whole book and the way that all of the characters have been a bit silly. It made sense that at the end of it, it was just like, and then we fixed it, done. So yeah, really entertaining, and I'm super excited to read another Austen at some point. This particular edition is the Penguin English Library paperback. They are so pretty. They are the ones I collect. And then the absolute final book I have to talk about is Irish Rebel by L.K. Shaw, which is book 7 of the Brooklyn Kings. This is a short mafia romance novella with an age gap. It was fine. It was fairly mundane. The smut was okay. The book was okay. It's 250 pages. If you want a light-hearted, I say light-hearted, a mafia style romance, you know, he's a killer, she's a brat, done. That's all I really have to say about that. So there we go, those are all 13 books I read in March. I've not done a wrap up this long in forever because War and Peace took up so much time that all my readings have been like only 6 books, and then March I just kind of smashed it out of the park. So do let me know in the comments down below, have you made it to the end? If so, well done, go get a snack, I need a drink of water. And do let me know what your thoughts are about the books, whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me, have they made it onto the TBR? You know the drill by now, team. Have a wonderful reading week and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.